Right before sunrise on a sheep station in the Australian outback, a million acres of red dirt, 700 kilometers from the nearest city, the only connection to the outside world is a single telephone bolted to the kitchen wall. And that telephone begins to ring. An elderly woman picks it up. The voice on the other end is a total stranger. He doesn't introduce himself. He says he's calling from Japan. He doesn't say how he got the number, but he has one question. He wants to know if anyone around her is bleeding from their ears. She doesn't know what to say. He tells her to turn the television on right now. She says, I don't have a television. There's no television out here. There never has been. And click, the line goes dead. A few moments go by and the phone rings again. A different voice this time, but the same question. Is anyone there bleeding from the ears? She says no, hangs up, and it rings again and again and again. What this woman is about to find out is that the people who used to live on her property weren't who they appeared to be. Not even close. Sharon White had just driven more than 700 kilometers to get here. 3 boys in the back of her car, their new home, a million-acre sheep station called Banjawarn, waiting at the end of the longest day of driving she'd ever done. She parks, the boys are out of the car before she cuts the engine, kicking up dust and exploring. Sharon walks through the homestead. And inside this working sheep station, she finds things that don't belong in a working sheep station. Glassware, laboratory equipment, containers of chemicals. She doesn't know what any of it is, and she doesn't know what it's been used for. She doesn't try to figure it out. She has 3 boys under her roof and unfamiliar chemicals within reach of small hands. And that's the only thing that matters. So she moves it, all of it, out of the house, out of reach, with her bare hands. As she explored the property out in the paddocks, Sharon found a patch of ground scattered with sheep carcasses. A cluster of them, left where they'd fallen. The drought had been merciless that year. Sheep were dying across the gold fields, just part of the cost of running stock. The previous owners had clearly given up trying to keep up. So she moves on. Now, this isn't the first station that Sharon had set foot on. Actually, she'd grown up on a station, on the Nullarbor, that vast, treeless plain in southern Australia where you can watch a storm roll in from 100 kilometers away. That kind of childhood builds a particular kind of person. Sharon could fix a fence before she could ride a bike. She'd done more hard physical work by the time she was a teenager than most adults do in a lifetime. By the time she arrived at Banjawarn, she was in her late 30s. 3 boys, no husband on the property, just her parents, and the dogs. Her father, Collie, was an old-school kind of guy. He taught Sharon everything he knew, and he never treated her any differently than her brothers. And her mother, Rosary, was the watcher of the family, sharp-eyed, practical, the kind of woman who could tell something was wrong with a person before they could. So the 3 of them, plus the kids, were the entire workforce on this property bigger than some countries. They'd taken on Banjawarn because the price was right. $300,000 for a million acres. At the time, that wouldn't buy you a 2-bedroom apartment in Sydney. And it had just bought the White family a working station the size of a small nation. It's suspiciously cheap, if you stop to think about it. But they didn't stop. The story they'd been told was simple. A group of Japanese nationals had bought the place through a company. They hadn't run it properly, and had eventually been forced to sell. Fences down, water points unreliable, the whole property half collapsed. Sharon didn't dig further. She inherited their problems and she'd fix what she could. Nights at Banjawarn were quiet. No television, no internet, a generator that ran for a few hours each evening. And when the generator went off, the silence came in. And it wasn't the soft quiet of a country cottage. It was the silence of a place where the nearest other human was a few 100 kilometers away in any direction. A silence so complete you could hear your own pulse in your ears. And that's the world that Sharon stepped into. A station, a drought that wouldn't break, 3 boys, long days, longer nights, and the slow grind of trying to bring a broken property back to life. And the previous owners were gone. Or at least, most of them were. A few of them stayed behind. They were the property caretakers, holdovers from the previous owners who hadn't gone back to Japan with the rest. Sharon was told they'd be there during the transition and then they would leave. So Sharon didn't think much of it. Out here in the goldfields, you get all sorts. Gold attracts prospectors, drifters, eccentrics, people who come out for a season and stay for a decade. So a few quiet Japanese men and women living in the back building of a million-acre property weren't worth losing sleep over. But they were strange. Sharon's days at Banjawarn started before sunrise and ended after dark. Hours of hard physical labor in scorching heat, moving stock, fixing fences, checking water points, hauling feed, and on the way back to the main house, she'd pass the caretaker's quarters, a small cluster of dongas set off from the homestead by a stretch of dirt. The first time she saw it, it stopped her in her tracks. The door on one of the dongas was open, and inside, in the dim light, were 3 of them, standing on their heads, their eyes closed, upside down and silent, like they were meditating. She watched them for a moment and they didn't move. They didn't acknowledge her. It was as if she wasn't there. So she keeps walking, getting on with whatever it was she was doing. And that became the rhythm of her days. She'd be out by the windmills, the yards, and somewhere in the middle of it, she'd walk past their quarters and catch a glimpse of their strange behavior. For long stretches, the caretakers wouldn't eat. 2 days, 3 days, sometimes longer, and they'd fast through the heat of the outback summer like it was nothing. And then there were tapes, cassette tapes, playing from inside their quarters whenever the generator kicked on. Repetitive droning, a kind of chanting that didn't sound like a prayer. It didn't sound like anything Sharon had ever heard before, but she wasn't afraid of them. They were peaceful, quiet, and they kept to themselves, and Sharon knew that they would be gone soon enough. But over time, Sharon's read on the caretaker situation began to shift. But not because of anything they did to her, it was what the mailman told her. His name is Bill Lever. He'd been driving the mail run through this part of the goldfields for years. Thousands of kilometers a week along dirt roads, delivering letters and groceries to stations spread across an area bigger than most countries, always enjoying a cup of tea while he waited for the recipients to reply to the letters he delivered. He knew every property, he knew every family, and he'd been delivering mail to Banjawarn long before the Whites arrived. So when Bill rolled in on one of his runs, he had stories. He told Sharon about the previous owners. He said they were young Japanese men and women, gaunt like they hadn't eaten in days. They weren't interested in him, and they weren't interested in tea. In fact, he saw one of the women drinking a strange colored liquid, making gagging noises as she was drinking from her cup. He asked what she was drinking, and she said it was a mixture of mustard and salt water. The woman told Bill she was purging demons from her body. One afternoon, he watched a man walk out and start cutting the lawn with a pair of scissors. Scissors, to cut a lawn the size of a small country. But the thing that stuck with Bill the most wasn't the scissors, it was a delivery. The previous owners had asked Bill to bring barrels of hydrochloric acid out to the property. Now, some stations would occasionally order a small amount of the stuff for their swimming pools. That wasn't unusual, but at Banjawarn, there was no swimming pool. There never had been. So Bill finished up his mail run and he drove off. The previous owners had been strange, but they were gone now. And the straggling caretakers were strange too, but they were leaving soon. The chemicals she moved out of the homestead were probably part of some odd story. Hobby chemistry, maybe a mining claim. Who knows? It was strange. But to Sharon, it wasn't a big deal. As she became more familiar with the property, she started noticing other things. Japanese writing on the inside wall of the machinery shed. Small characters, neatly painted. She didn't speak Japanese. She didn't know what it said. And one of the outbuildings, there was a door with Japanese characters painted across it. She walked past it most days. She never opened it. She didn't think about what was behind it. And this was Sharon's life, day in and day out at Banjawarn Station. Life went on the way it always had. But someone, somewhere in the world outside of Banjawarn, was about to do something terrible. On the night of June 27, 1994, while Sharon was rebuilding fences and Bill was driving his mail run, a converted refrigerator truck rolled into a quiet residential neighborhood in the Japanese city of Matsumoto and parked on a narrow street. Within minutes, residents in the houses around it began collapsing, choking, vomiting, losing their vision. Some never made it out of bed. By morning, 8 people were dead. More than 500 were hospitalized. The Japanese police didn't know what had killed those people in Matsumoto. They didn't know who. So they looked at the most obvious suspect they could find, a local salesman who had chemicals at his house. His own wife had been left in a coma by whatever had drifted through the neighborhood that night. But the police didn't know that yet. The press tore him to pieces. They called him a killer chemist and a monster. His name was Yoshiyuki Kono, and he wasn't any of those things. He was a man whose wife was dying in a hospital bed and whose life was being destroyed in the newspaper at the same time. It would take nearly a year before the world found out who had really killed his neighbors. By then, his name was already ruined. But back at Banjawarn, the caretakers were finally moving out. They were friendly enough on the way out. They packed their things, they thanked the family, and they got in their vehicle and drove down the long dirt road. Sharon watched them go, and just like that, the property was fully hers. That strangeness was over. Whatever weird chapter Banjawarn had been through, it was finally closed. And for the next several months, life on this station was simple. The year ended, but a new one was about to begin. On the morning of December 12, 1994, a 28-year-old man named Tadahito Hamaguchi was walking to work on a street in Osaka. A stranger sneaks up behind him and presses something to the back of his neck. Hamaguchi spun around and chased the stranger for a few steps before collapsing. Within hours, he was vomiting. Within a day, he was on a ventilator. And 10 days later, he was dead. He was the first person in history confirmed killed by a nerve agent called VX. There would be 2 more like him in the same window. 2 more men approached by strangers. 2 more cases the Japanese police could not explain. Now, back at Banjawarn, that phone we mentioned in the beginning begins ringing. Rosary walked into the kitchen and told Sharon about the call. The voice from Japan, the question about bleeding ears, and Sharon said, "What's this load of crap?" But the phone kept ringing, different voices, same question, all of them urging the family to turn on the TV. So Rosary called a friend who had a television. She asked her to turn on the news and ring back. A few minutes later, the phone rang. There had been an attack in Tokyo on the subway during morning peak hour. Something had been released into the trains, some kind of gas. People were collapsing on platforms, on stairs, on the streets outside the stations. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. The footage of Tokyo was chaos. Bodies on the floor, commuters in business suites being carried into hospitals, doctors in masks. It was being called a terrorist attack. The Japanese police were searching for suspects, and Sharon listened. A terrorist attack in Japan with some kind of gas. And someone, somewhere in Japan, had thought to call a remote sheep station in the middle of the Australian outback and ask if her family was bleeding. She didn't need a detective to put it together. The strange caretakers, the chemicals in the homestead, the Japanese writing on the door she never opened, the barrels of acid that Bill Lever had delivered to a property with no swimming pool. The previous owners of Banjawarn weren't just strange, they were the people on the news. Sharon stood there in her kitchen with a million acres of red dirt around her in every direction. Every door, every shed, every corner of the property was suddenly a crime scene. She picked up the phone and called the family lawyer. The lawyer called the Australian Federal Police. And within hours, the world Sharon White had been living in for the last 12 months stopped existing. The AFP came in fast, Land Cruisers down the dirt road, the airstrip blocked, the gates sealed, nobody came in and nobody went out. Sharon, her parents, and her boys stayed put. The investigation moved in around them. 2 officers led it on the ground. The police force would spend months at Banjawarn, long enough that they ended up building a brick barbecue next to the homestead so they can cook somewhere. This wasn't a normal crime scene. It was a million-acre crime scene. Every shed, every outbuilding, every patch of disturbed ground had to be examined. Forensic teams were flown in, soil specialists, chemical analysts. The isolation that had drawn the previous owners to Banjawarn was now the biggest obstacle to figuring out what they'd done there. And through all of it, Sharon stayed. She and her boys lived at the homestead the entire time the investigation was running. The AFP worked around them. She'd boil the kettle for officers who'd just come back from photographing a building she'd never opened. Her sons watched men in masks load chemical samples into vehicles parked next to the yard where they played, and she didn't ask questions. She didn't want to. Whatever the AFP was finding, she'd hear about it eventually. And piece by piece, over weeks, then months, the picture started to emerge. The chemicals Sharon had moved out of the homestead a year earlier were not a hobby kit. They were the remnants of a working laboratory. Hydrochloric acid, nitric acid, perchloric acid, the kind of supplies you keep when you're making something nefarious. Gas masks, glass tubing, beakers, Bunsen burners, ceramic grinding bowls, and on one of those outbuildings that Sharon had walked past most days without ever opening, the investigators translated the Japanese characters painted across the surface. It reads, Toyota Laboratory. It was inside that building the AFP found that members of the previous owner's group had been manufacturing a nerve agent called sarin. Colorless, odorless, within seconds of exposure, a person starts choking, convulsing, and losing control of their own body. In high enough doses, they die, and they die fast. It doesn't exist in nature, it has to be created by people in a laboratory. It had been made at Banjawarn, in a building Sharon had walked past every day for a year. Remember those dead sheep out in the paddocks? Well, investigators began examining the carcasses. Sharon and her family had assumed those animals had died in the drought. What was unusual was what the AFP's chemists found in the soil beneath them. A chemical called methylphosphonic acid. It's what's left behind when sarin breaks down. 29 carcasses, the dirt underneath them, and inside of one of the buildings, investigators recovered a Japanese document titled Banjawarn Station, containing markings used to classify dead and injured animals. The previous owners had been testing sarin on the sheep. Sharon had carried those chemical containers out of the homestead with her bare hands, past the room where her boys slept. And the AFP wasn't done. The previous owners had purchased mining leases on the surrounding land. They had consulted geologists, they had asked about buying a ship, and they discussed exporting ore from Banjawarn in 44-gallon drums. They had also been digging with an excavator, but they weren't looking for gold. They were looking for uranium. This was an organization actively pursuing chemical weapons and nuclear weapons at the same time, on a million-acre property in the Australian outback that nobody had been watching. The group had a name, Shinrikyo, the Japanese doomsday cult founded by a partially blind bearded guru named Shoko Asahara, who preached that the world was about to end in a nuclear Armageddon, and that his followers would be among the only survivors. By the early 1990s, had tens of thousands of members. Many of them were university educated, scientists, chemists, physicists, engineers, drawn in by the promise that within the cult, they could experiment with weapons and technology no university would ever let them touch. So they bought Banjawarn precisely because of what Sharon had loved about it. The isolation, the silence, the fact that nobody anywhere was watching. But the cult wasn't waiting for an apocalypse to end the world. They were trying to start one. Asahara had told his followers that World War III was coming, that nuclear and chemical weapons would soon wipe out the planet, and that when the dust settled, his cult, and only his cult, would walk out of the rubble as the rulers of whatever was left. But Shoko Asahara didn't want to wait. The sarin in Tokyo subway was meant to provoke a response. War, retaliation, chaos, the kind of global crisis that would set apocalypse in motion. And the uranium at Banjawarn was meant to give them their own nuclear weapon to use when the time came. Banjawarn wasn't a hideout, it was a staging ground for the end of the world. But the people Sharon had lived alongside, the friendly young caretakers who stood on their heads and fasted and played droning tapes, were members of this group. On March 20th of 1995, 5 members of Shinrikyo boarded 5 separate trains during the morning peak hour in Tokyo, each carrying plastic bags wrapped in newspaper, filled with sarin. One of those men was named Toru Toyota, a physics graduate, a senior member of the cult. His name was the one painted on the door at Banjawarn. As the trains pulled into the busiest stations in central Tokyo, the men pierced the bags with the sharpened tips of their umbrellas. Then they got off, walked up the stairs, and disappeared into the crowd. Behind them, the cars filled with vapor. A woman on the Hibiya line started to watch a strange liquid spreading across the floor of her carriage. She saw the man across from her slump in his seat. By the time she looked back at the puddle, she couldn't see it anymore. Her vision was going. Within minutes, commuters were collapsing in train cars, on platforms, on the stairs leading out of stations. Some made it to the street before they fell, and some didn't. 13 people died, roughly 50 were left permanently injured, and thousands more were blinded, hospitalized, and traumatized. It would become known as the first major chemical attack of the modern terrorist era, and the gas they used, the nerve agent that killed those commuters on a Monday morning in Tokyo, had been refined and tested at the property where Sharon White had spent the last year raising her children. Sharon's rating on those caretakers definitely changed. She says, "I lived for a short time with mass murderers and I didn't know it. Goes to show you never can tell." The evidence the AFP gathered at Banjawarn was sent to Japan, where it formed part of the prosecution against Shinrikyo. It was also sent to Washington, where a U.S. Senate subcommittee used it as a foundation for a major inquiry into the cult's pursuit of weapons of mass destruction. Detective Superintendent Blaise O'Shaughnessy, who led parts of the AFP investigation, would later call Banjawarn the birth of Australia's terrorist era. The recommendations that came out of that million-acre crime scene shaped much of the counter-terrorism legislation Australia uses to this day. Legal proceedings in Japan stretched on for more than 2 decades. Appeals, retrials, sentences handed down, challenged, and then handed down again. The men who pierced those bags on the Tokyo subway, the chemists who built the nerve agent, the leadership who ordered it, all of them sat on death row for years. And in July of 2018, 13 of them were executed by hanging. Among them was Shoko Asahara himself, the founder, the prophet, the man who had told tens of thousands of followers that the end of the world was coming and that he was the one who would save them. The cult itself never entirely disappeared. It was banned as a terrorist organization, it splintered, and then it rebranded. And today it operates under a new name, Aleph. And it's still monitored by the Japanese government. But Banjawarn went back to being always what it tried to be, a station. Now, Banjawarn transitioned from sheep to cattle. The shearing shed eventually collapsed. The old homestead, the one that Sharon had carried those chemicals out with bare hands, fell into ruin until only the frame was left. The laboratory door itself was removed by investigators, and today it sits in a glass case at the AFP Museum in Canberra. The only trace of Shinrikyo still at Banjawarn is in the machinery shed. Small Japanese writing on the inside wall. Instructions on how to turn the generator on. Sharon White is still at Banjawarn. She's been running the place for more than a quarter of a century. From time to time, a casual worker who's been offered a job will Google the property, find the history, and tell her that they've changed their minds. She laughs about it, saying we might be a bit crazy, but it's not from that stuff. And if you ask her about it now, if you sit at her kitchen table the way visitors sometimes still do, she'll tell you that 1995 was nothing more than a small interruption in a quiet life she's always loved. The media frenzy that came afterwards bothered her more than the cult ever did. For Sharon, Banjawarn is still what it was the day she pulled up with her 3 boys, a station, a million acres of red dirt, and silence. As for Shinrikyo, what they did, who they were, how a doomsday cult ended up recruiting chemists, scientists, and nuclear engineers from the collapsing Soviet Union, that's a story for another day. And there's one more thing about Banjawarn nobody's ever fully explained. On the night of May 28, 1993, months before Sharon ever set foot on the property, seismographs in Australia picked up a tremor near Banjawarn Station, magnitude of 3.6. It wasn't shaped like an earthquake. The signature was wrong, too sharp, too sudden, closer to the pattern of an explosion than a tectonic event. A U.S. Senate inquiry took it seriously enough to ask the question out loud. Had Shinrikyo detonated something on that property? And to this day, nobody knows for sure what made it. But Sharon got it right the first time. It's true. You never can tell. Somewhere in the world right now, on some quiet road in some quiet town, somebody is moving in next door to people they will never really know. Watching them through the kitchen window, wondering what they do for a living, smiling politely when they meet each other's gaze on trash day, filing it away as nothing. And that's how it always starts. Thanks for watching this video. If you want to hear more of history's mysteries or life's disturbing discoveries, make sure you like, subscribe, share it with a friend, and ring that bell for notifications so you don't miss out on what's coming next. If you got any weird stories you want to share, leave it down in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, bye.